Welcome to another edition of Why Wasn't It Better? I'm Patrick Darms.
And I'm Anton Pross.
And this is the podcast where we discuss hyped up, somewhat disappointing films. We'll introduce the film, tell you why it was chosen for the podcast, tell you how it got made, and then provide a few reasons that answer the question, why wasn't it better? Anton, thank you for joining me on this unusual Monday that we've chosen to record on.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I'm excited to be here. I got a question for you. Do you know Richie Roberts gave up $1 million in unmarked bills?
Really? Did Richie Roberts find? Did you telling me he found $1 million in unmarked cash and just turned it in?
Yeah, I can't think of anyone in the room that would raise their arms and say that they would turn in that $1 million, but Richie Roberts found $1 million in unmarked bills and turned it in.
I'll tell you what that is, my friend. That is honesty.
That is honesty. That's good police.
That's a good cop.
Yeah.
I sort of just did a Boston accent there for one reason or another. The movie that we're talking about today is, of course, American Gangster, the story of Harlem gangster Frank Lucas, who rose to power in early 1970s New York, equaling and surpassing the notorious mafia families with the reach of his heroin empire. On the other side of the law, honest cop Richie Roberts dedicates himself to taking down, quote, the most dangerous man walking the streets.
Yeah. One of those really great films that in the trailer, in the hype, and of course with those great words based on a true story. So there's some historical fact to this film. Really excited to dig in.
I gave a little synopsis there. Some of the feedback that we received for our previous recordings was, of course, tell us a little bit about the film. We mistakenly believed that maybe every listener was super familiar with these movies. And I think in most cases they are, but that's some of the feedback I got. Like, tell us a little bit about what the film is before you introduce it. Nonetheless, before we get into this, as always, we'll do a little admin. You can reach us at wwibpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feedback. And I think we mentioned this on the last recording we did, but we're now on the Twitters.
Yes, we are.
You can tweet us at WWIB Podcast. I think that's the name of the Twitter. I actually haven't been on the Twitter account since I created it. Probably says a lot about how seriously we're taking Twitter. And once we, just so the listeners know, once Anton and I realized that Twitter was really here to stay, we decided to get on it. We had, I think, when did they invent Twitter? Like 2008. So we had 15 years to really make sure that it wasn't going anywhere before
we were real trendsetters.
Yeah. Sometimes you just want to make sure. Like, I never got a MySpace, right? Because I was like, I'm not sure about this one. Fast forward 20 years later,
we gave it
I don't regret it.
We gave it some time before the platform almost completely imploded under Elon, which it didn't.
Right. No, I guess not. I was able to create an account without hassle, so they've certainly made that easy. Anyway, American Gangster. This movie was released on October 20th, 2007 by Universal Pictures and Imagine Entertainment. Directed by Ridley Scott, screenplay by Steven Zaillian. You know that name. Yeah, this movie's based on a true story. However, the inspiration for this movie specifically came from a New York Magazine story called The Return of Superfly by Mark Jacobson. The movie stars Denzel Washington, Russell Crowe, Josh Brolin, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Ted Buffalo Bill Levine, Ruby Dee, Cuba Gooding Jr., Armand Asante, John Ortiz. Budget of $100 million and $266 million at the box office.
What a list of names! Quite a list of names.
It is. Yeah, there's a lot of well-known actors on here. I didn't list them all. We do like a cutoff at some point, but. Yeah, really a great cast. Anton, I know when we kind of trade off picking these. I know you were excited to do this, but this is our first non-sequel, a completely original standalone movie.
Good call there, and that's a good hallmark.
It is. A lot of these movies that we talk about, why wasn't it better? It's inevitably going to involve a lot of sequels, and I think at last count, if we look at our list, about 40% of the movies that we have slated are sequels. So plenty of original stuff in here too. But the reason I chose this movie, this is probably going to surprise a lot of listeners, because when I mentioned to a couple of my friends that we were covering this movie, I got the same feedback and they were all like, "Oh, but that's a good movie." That's kind of the point. On paper, this movie should have been great. Everybody seems to like this movie when you bring it up, but I did ask for the same people. I asked them, "Oh, well, what's your favorite scene?" Nobody could remember anything.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. In the lead up to recording, I did also anecdotally ask a few people, had they seen American Gangster? What do they enjoy? And they say, "Oh, Denzel film. It's great." But what? Hard to come up with very concrete examples.
In some ways, this movie is the genesis for this podcast a long time ago. Because when I first heard about this movie, probably when I saw the trailer, I was like, wait a minute, Denzel is playing a drug lord who's being investigated by Russell Crowe, and it's set in the 70s, and it's directed by Ridley Scott. Take my money.
Oh, fantastic, right?
I got Heat vibes. I got serious Pacino versus De Niro Heat vibes.
Mm-hmm.
Because 2007, when this movie came out, Denzel was, at the time, and still is, I'd say him or Tom Hanks, greatest actors of their generation. You know, pick one or the other. You could
no
pick,
hyperbole
no
there.
wrong answer.
Very true. Objectively phenomenal actor. Russell Crowe.
And then Russell Crowe, his star has faded a little bit since then, but he was very much an A-lister back then. We'll get to him a little bit later. But Anton, so this is the second time Denzel and Crowe have squared off against each other in a movie. Can you name the first movie?
It's
not very good.
So I was just thinking that when I was rewatching the film, like, I feel like these two have been in a film together. It isn't somehow that Russell Crowe was in Training Day, was he?
No.
Right? Like, I was like, it wasn't like he was an extra or anything in that. No. Okay.
It's a movie called Virtuosity.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a science fiction action movie from the mid-90s, and I have not seen it in years. I don't remember it being good. So these guys, they had worked with each other before. Getting into the Ridley Scott of it all, he had directed a number of duds by this point, but his stock was still sky high in 2007. On paper, I would say of all the movies that we've covered so far, this one probably maybe has the highest potential for greatness that I can think of. If you compare it to like a sports team, this is a super team. This is like...
Oh, huge.
For all you soccer fans out there, this is like a Galacticos team from the mid-2000s. And I say that despite being a Barcelona fan that does not like Real Madrid at all. This is an all-star team.
Right. Yeah. Basketball fans, this is LeBron. This is LeBron to the Heat with Ray Allen. To all
the Heat players, you named Ray Allen first.
Yeah, well, that was the super team they built, right?
Yeah, you're like step aside, Dwayne Wade.
Yeah. Dwayne who?
What?
But of course, relevant to now, I don't think there are any super teams built because I don't count the Suns as a super team. Anyway, to the next point.
Not with... How old is Chris Paul? Like 42? No, I'm kidding. He's not that old.
Yeah.
But so
to the next point. Yeah.
This movie, it was very well received when it came out. 81% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Got, good reviews. Nominated for 2 Oscars. Ruby Dee for Best Supporting Actress, and it got a nomination for Art Direction. But this movie does not have the legs that it really should. We kind of teased it in the beginning. When you bring this movie up, almost everyone will tell you, "Oh, it's good. I really like that movie." Nobody really says it's great, thus making it a perfect candidate for this podcast.
Yeah. I mean, would you say that in terms of the challenge of covering this film, it's almost as though it was an investigation, like trying to take down one of the biggest crime bosses in history?
Yes. Like the last movie we covered was The Matrix Reloaded. That was pretty easy to figure out.
That was a softball pitch.
Yeah.
That was underhand softball pitch.
I think either you or I referred to it as low-hanging fruit.
Right.
It's like anytime you bring up real super hyped movies that were disappointing, Matrix Reloaded is like always at the top of the list. Like when we do Phantom Menace, it's like what hasn't been said about that movie already. This movie, you mentioned this being a challenge. This is definitely more of a challenge. I have toiled over this for years, trying to figure out why this movie wasn't better. Before we get to the reasons, though, Anton, tell us about the production history. How'd this movie get made?
It would be my pleasure. I mean, this movie's origins trace back to 2000 when Universal Pictures and Imagine Entertainment acquired the film rights to the New York Magazine story The Return of Superfly by Mark Jacobson that Patrick had mentioned earlier. And it's about the story of Frank Lucas and his heroin empire. So producer Brian Grazer was hooked and instantly went about acquiring the film rights. So Ridley Scott, Alien himself, was interested very early on, and 2 years later, Steven Zalian was hired to write
Zalian?
Zalian was hired to write a 170-page script. Before they could begin pre-production, Scott decided to make Kingdom of Heaven as his next project, which also is a very big undertaking.
We should do that movie.
Oh yeah, definitely. Denzel was offered the role early on, but was initially uninterested in playing Lucas, which is beyond me. And at one point, Brian De Palma's name was attached, but Antoine Fuqua emerged as the frontrunner. Benicio del Toro was going to play Richie Roberts. Let's think about what that kind of film would have been.
Yeah.
And production was set to begin in 2004 with an unexpected release of June 2005. Universal wanted to relocate shooting to Toronto to save money, but Fuqua was adamant on keeping it in New York and tried to find ways to save money. At this point, we're staring at a $93 million budget. And I don't have a lot of specifics, but Universal fought Fuqua left and right during pre-production, finally firing him in October 2004, weeks before shooting was set to begin. So there was some turmoil on set. And by this point, they had invested $30 million in the project with nothing left to show for it. They scrambled to replace him, and they talked to Peter Berg, but that petered out, and they ended up canceling the project. Denzel had been paid a $20 million salary up front. That's Denzel money right there, right?
I'm applauding him.
Yeah, Del Toro was paid $5 million, and Del Toro, kudos to him, got to keep the salary. Pretty good haul for him, considering he didn't do anything, right?
Yeah, like do they have any more movies he could be in and not be in and get money?
And in March 2005, Universal and Imagine decided to revive the project. They hired Terry George to rewrite the script, envisioning a cheaper, scaled-down version of Zalian's original vision. A recent Oscar winner and Oscar controversy winner, Will Smith, becomes linked with the Lucas role, but once again, the studio decides not to move forward. Brian Grazer makes the decision here.
I can't imagine Will Smith in this type of role. And back then, he was Teflon. He was everything he was in turned to gold, except for Wild Wild West. But you bringing him up,
he was still the coolest thing about that film.
I think the less said about that movie, the better.
Wiggle, wild.
Jim West, Desperado. Recently, though, I've been rethinking my opinion of him in general. Has Will Smith ever been in a great movie? This is a discussion for another time, but I wanted to get you thinking about that. I don't think Ali was a great movie. No.
I thought Ali is so underrated.
I don't like that movie.
We'll debate it for another time.
We can do that on an episode. Should have been better.
Good question. We'll let the listeners ponder, and it'll set up for the matchup of was it or was it not a good film, or as Patrick says, why wasn't it better? So while working on another project, Zalian convinced Ridley Scott to return to this one, and the studio finally gave the green light. This is also where Denzel re-enters the picture, Mr. Training Day. Brad Pitt and Russell Crowe both pursued for the role of Richie Roberts before Crowe ended up accepting the role. I think, Patrick, you did the research here in terms of not being able to find a reliable source for Crowe's salary. Can you talk us through a little bit of that history?
Yeah, so Denzel got $20 million for this picture. as you just pointed out. I would assume Crowe's salary was also in that same range, and this sent me down like a little bit of a rabbit hole in terms of like how much money he actually made, because he's just not the actor that he was, right? He earned $5 million for Gladiator. The same year, he got $7.5 million for Proof of Life. Great movie, underrated movie. 2001, he gets $15 million for A Beautiful Mind. $20 million for Master and Commander. $15 million for Cinderella Man. Another $20 million for Robin Hood. So during the peak 10-ish years of his career, starting in about 2000, Russell Crowe earned well over $150 million in base salary alone. Talk about getting the bag.
Oh, he was one of the 2000s kings, right?
Yeah. I think one of the most talented actors we've ever had. I really like him.
I mean, now I feel like there's a lot of criticism of Russell Crowe at this point in his career, but we'll see how he continues to mature and develop at this part of his career. But definitely early on, and considering his body of work, very, very successful actor.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, nobody can stay on top forever. Except for Denzel. He's still the same guy he was then.
Sopranos legend James Gandolfini was offered the role of Trupo, but turned it down. Josh Brolin took the part, and it was filmed over a period of approximately 4 months in over 180 different locations, most of them across New York, and it set the record for containing the highest number of filming locations of a movie. I thought that was very impressive as well, looking at the film, being able to identify the exact spots where I'd stood at that intersection trying to find where I couldn't find while on the road. It was a film with a storied production history, a lot of moves to actually make it happen, and a lot of moving parts that really added to the equation of why wasn't it better. So with that, Patrick, will you lead us in the first reason of why wasn't American Gangster a better film?
Was Ridley Scott the right choice for director?
Ooh.
And I say this as someone who is a fan of Ridley Scott to a certain degree. He has directed what is perhaps my favorite movie of all time, Gladiator. He's done some masterpieces, as you know, Alien, Blade Runner, Black Hawk Down's a great movie. Hannibal, just kidding. But by the time this movie gets made, a lot of people had passed on it. There had been a lot of, like you mentioned the script by Zalian, but there had been a lot of uncredited rewrites. Now, he chose to direct this movie, Ridley Scott did, by highlighting the, quote, paradoxical values of Lucas and Roberts. But I don't think he was the right director for this movie. It might be a little unfair, but I would have preferred an American director for a movie called American Gangster. I think Fuqua, who was the original choice here, I would much rather see this movie directed by him. And I'm saying that, yes, because of Training Day.
Fair, right? Someone that really knows how to portray that kind of very American style of dramatic gangster culture, right?
Now, that being said, Ridley Scott is the best director in terms of what's called world building. He's a master of it. Like you mentioned, all the filming locations, and this movie rightfully got an Oscar nomination for its art direction. The production design is outstanding. Even in 2006 or 7 when they filmed this, Harlem was a very different place in the 70s.
Agreed.
A much more
seedy.
grittier. Yes, a much more dangerous place. There's a lot more crime in Harlem back then. Harlem's a completely different place now, and this movie looks completely convincing. It really looks like they filmed it in 1970s Harlem, and give Scott the credit for that. His movies, even if you don't care for them in terms of maybe the story, like look at something. Well, we mentioned Hannibal. I think Hannibal's a terrible movie. We're going to cover it. Hannibal's a great looking movie. It's got a really cool visual style. And Robin Hood, which he also did with Russell Crowe, I think was kind of a dud, but it looks great. His movies always look great. I still think Ridley Scott's going to take a beating on this podcast. He really has done some of my favorite movies. He's a very uneven director, and I think if he doesn't have a great script, it might not work well for him.
But where it does translate is when there's full alignment, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned the budget, and Universal was really concerned about the budget, and that's that was at least a public reason why they fired Fuqua in the first place. I just found it funny how they fire him for budget concerns. It goes through this checkered production, and they still ended up with $100 million budget. It's like all for naught.
Let's kind of think about it's a very common theme, right? The more change of hands is to a film, the more the original vision can get murky or mixed around, and even that sense, right, when it's handed to a different director, things can get, there isn't full alignment, as we talked about, in terms of being able to tell the story as it quote unquote should be told. Would you agree with that?
I would. The number two reason.
Yeah, go ahead.
Flawed storytelling.
Yeah.
You just alluded to this. This is probably an even bigger reason than Ridley Scott being the director. And, we mentioned the source material. It's based on that magazine article, which you can find. I actually read it to prep for this. It's a really cool read. And it's based on a true story. But a lot of this is heavily fictionalized, according to Frank Lucas himself. Amount. Richie Roberts himself criticized it. By the way, did you know that he found $1 million in unmarked cash and turned it in?
Richie Roberts did that?
Yeah, super honest cop. But he actually, real life Richie Roberts, who also found $1 million, he criticized
arrested for tax fraud.
Wouldn't that have been good?
No, actually, he got arrested for tax fraud.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. Doing research for the film, found that in his defense attorney, in his career as a defense attorney, later in his life, he was arrested for tax fraud, tax evasion.
I completely missed that, and I am now liking the movie even less.
Because it was. I don't think it takes away, and especially when you consider how the story wasn't saying, right, that Richie Roberts was the best cop out there. It wasn't even saying that he wasn't even saying he was the most honest cop when we think about what is honesty, because it did show he was a flawed character. So I think just harping on that one line really didn't do it any favors, especially, like you said, knowing what actually happened in real life later in life for him.
That is ridiculous. Well, he criticized the movie. Real life Richie Roberts. He criticized this movie for portraying Frank Lucas as too noble of a character. So
romanticized its film.
It is. I get that. You have to take certain liberties with something. It's a bad title, American Gangster. They put a lot of pressure on themselves because it's sort of American Gangster, but it's also... Look, here's the problem with the storytelling. It's two movies. One is about the rise of Frank Lucas, who becomes a drug kingpin in Harlem. The other is about Richie Roberts, a cop turned federal investigator who focuses on drugs and corruption in the New York area crime scene. Historical inaccuracies aside, you're expecting from the title a biopic of Frank Lucas and his rise, and you get half of that in the movie. The other half is the Roberts part. Both of these stories could have been compelling. I don't believe either is given enough screen time.
I agree with that. Definitely agree with that. Especially when we look at the meat of those stories being told, there was a lot of jump cuts, sometimes a little jarring in terms of the storytelling being told. We assume is going on concurrently, but sometimes because of the way that it cut would not lend itself to the same momentum of a good story being told for either story. Agreed.
Yeah, it's like you're watching the Cliff Notes version of both stories. And this is all in a movie that's pushing 3 hours. And I'll give you a perfect example of this is where you mentioned like jump cuts. So Frank starts off as the driver for Bumpy, right? That guy who's running Harlem prior to him. All of a sudden, Bumpy's just dead, and that's it. It's very abrupt. I would have enjoyed this movie a lot more. I think you probably would too if it was just Frank Lucas's story or Robert's investigation, but not both.
I agree, and I want to pose a scenario to our listeners of what could have been a better way to tell Frank's origin while including Bumpy. Now, a good story doesn't need someone to just speak a lot and just describe who the characters are or what the setting is. Especially with film, it could be the action of Frank doing the dirty work for Bumpy, really establishing that, like, this is a gangster film. But instead, we're really just opening up to Bumpy walking him down the street, talking about the good old days, and then dying in an electronics store. Is that right? So really, we don't have any brevity as to who Bumpy was, or why should we even care about Frank as a gangster?
Well said. I wanted to, every time that Frank's story came on screen, I wanted to see more of it, and I just wasn't getting enough of it. I enjoyed every scene with Denzel. I liked what he was doing. And then it would cut to the Richie Roberts stuff. And it's worth pointing out, Richie Roberts does not even appear in the New York Magazine article. According to the research, again, I understand they take liberties. He only played a minor part in the Lucas story.
Yeah, I so read that when you really think. Yeah, when you think about that character, it's more of a composite character of a lot of all the different individuals that had a part in taking down Frank Lucas.
Right, and now that in of itself is not a problem, but all of the stuff that they waste screen time on, right? Like him turning in the money, his junkie partner, his failed marriage, the womanizing. None of this stuff has anything to do with Frank Lucas, the American gangster.
It's wasted screen time trying to build up a foil to Frank Lucas, a fake foil.
He never even had a custody battle in real life. That was completely fabricated for the movie. All of this is building up to show how honest he is. You could have just cut it out of the movie. It's very heavy-handed. And look, we mentioned this before, and he turned down, he found $1 million in unmarked cash and turned it in, and because he's honest, $1 million. And look, we are repeating this.
Richie Roberts, he turned in $1 million in unmarked bills.
He did. And the reason why we keep repeating this is they say it in the movie about 27 times. And I think that's the biggest waste, because they could have just established it with a brief dialogue. Like, you remember when he assembles the task force, when Buffalo Bill gets him to organize like the task force of cops, and then I think it's the RZA brings it up. He's like, "Hey, I heard you found $1 million," and he's like, "Yeah, I did." Right? They could have just covered it with that, but instead they have to show 10 to 15 minutes of him and his uninteresting drug addicted partner finding the money illegally. By the way, I'll get to that in a little bit later. Then they turn it in, and then Buffalo Bill's like, "Well, where's the rest?" His character's puzzling as well. The Roberts character, not Buffalo Bill. Yeah. Buffalo Bill's not actually in this movie. But Richie Roberts is puzzling.
I told you this before. It was hard for me to root for Richie Roberts. It was not a compelling character.
No. He's... I hadn't seen the movie in years when we rewatched it for this. I can't figure him out. He won't go on the take, to borrow a term. Like, he won't take corrupt money, right? But he has no issue breaking other rules. They illegally break into the car where they find the money. He doesn't do search warrants. He'll threaten witnesses.
He'll punch taxi drivers.
He will. I forgot about that. Yeah, he'll assault a taxi driver. He will even use his childhood friend who's in the mafia for sources of information. But he won't take money. And even his wife, played by the great Carla Gugino, I think that's how you say her name. I struggle with some of these names. She's really good, although her character is completely unnecessary for the movie. She even points out this hypocrisy to him. She points this out to him when in one of those dumb custody scenes in court. She's like, "You do all this dumb stuff, bad stuff, but you won't take money." We're not the only people who have an issue with this. Jeremy Hallman of MovieMartyr.com says, quote, "Curiously, Denzel Washington's drug czar Frank Lucas is presented more as a co-protagonist than an antagonist, getting what seems to be equal screen time as co-lead Russell Crowe's Detective Roberts. This imbalance eats away at the film's moral center, leaving the audience little to care about amidst all the superficial gloss." End quote.
Great. That's really, that does capture it.
It does. All the Roberts stuff, it drags. And these two central
versus the story
characters,
we wanted to hear, right? Frank
yes,
Lucas.
these two central characters do not interact until 2 hours and 33 minutes into the movie. That's an eternity.
Sometimes writing done well, that builds to the climax, and I don't think necessarily that the characters have to if it's a game of cat and mouse, the characters don't necessarily have to interact, but the
Right,
way that it was
like in Heat.
written, it was so exactly just like in Heat.
Yes.
But so underwhelming in what actually happened in the way that the film told how their story went.
The duopoly absolutely worked in Heat, and they have that one they're doing the cat and mouse thing. They have that one interaction at the diner when they get coffee together, and then they sort of interact during the shootout, but that I wouldn't call that like an actual acting scene. They're shooting at each other from across the LA streets. And then they meet again at the end, right?
Right.
But the movie's centered around that. The movie American Gangster also should have been centered around that. But instead we just get these two contrasting stories. This is the first example of what I call too long, too short. I would have much preferred this movie if it was just 2 hours long or a 6-hour miniseries. And it's neither. It gets caught in this halfway house. Now, the 175-minute extended edition, I think it's a step in the right direction, but it would have worked better as a miniseries. And the reason why I couldn't figure out why I didn't like this movie as much as I did when it came out is all the content that we've gotten since then. Just imagine, Anton, if this was a 6-hour series on HBO or Netflix. Imagine if this was another season of Narcos.
What would have been better, right, is literally all of the things that we talked about in the story. Either not enough investment in the stories that we really cared about. So having a full hour focusing on Frank Lucas, what him and his family did. Or instead of making up a Richie Roberts character, or maybe telling the actual stories of what those in the investigation were actually able to do, which I'm sure was probably more compelling in being able to identify and find the leads and really go after Frank Lucas. Like you said, being able to focus on those stories and give them the right attention really lends itself to a better story, momentum wise, and just lends itself to a better, less half baked way of storytelling.
Completely agree. If you had that lengthy series, you get just a far more complete story, like you just said. Everything you want about Frank. If you really want to see stuff about Richie Roberts, you can get all that fun family stuff that he deals with. The Nicky Barnes of it all, which we'll get into in our next reason. But this version that we have, it's just spread too thin. Like a lot of this, it's such a long movie, but so many of the scenes feel cut short. Like, do you remember the scene when the newly assembled task force, they go out, they buy Blue Magic, and then they start to speculate with they have the big cork board up, and they start to speculate who could be behind it all, right? Is it the mafia? Is it this guy? Is it that guy? It would have been but rather than have all the detectives on the task force speculate and start to give their theories, it just cuts away to Frank Lucas at his club. It's trying to be all these different elements that we've seen in previous movies: French Connection, Scarface, Heat, Serpico. It's trying to pull from all these movies.
Which, this is just my speculation. When trying to come up with such a great film with high expectations, paying homage to films like those will, like, it's clear, right? Like, there's a lot of great ideas of how scenes are shown that we can look to those films like Serpico, Scarface, Heat, that we can see in American Gangster. And I feel like probably a director like Ridley Scott would take a lot of would look at a lot of that and say, hey, that'll translate well into the film. And that's not uncommon. You'll see a lot of those homages or ways that really parallel in plenty of other films. But I think here it didn't translate well because this was a very unique story to be told, and it didn't end up being a great way to tell a story more than it was like a sticker that you place on the film, and then just cut to the next story. or cut to the next scene. It was not effective storytelling.
Agree. Yeah. Number 3, the acting / the characters. A lot of great actors here on paper.
Oh, a lot of actors that made a lot of paper.
Very well said. Denzel, what do you think of Denzel in this movie?
I can't fault Denzel. I
No,
thought Denzel brought the heat.
he's very good because he's never bad. He's very good in this movie.
Listeners were expecting a butt.
Well, considering the type of role that this is, I expected better from him. But maybe that's just because he's done so much excellent work across the board and everything. But I'm not even sure if this is one of his 10 best performances. Now, that's subjective, clearly, but here's my list of my favorite Denzel performances in no particular order. Malcolm X, Training Day, Flight, Man on Fire, Glory, Crimson Tide, Courage Under Fire, The Hurricane, Philadelphia, Inside Man, Unstoppable, Remember the Titans, The Preacher's Wife, Deja Vu, The Equalizer, The Pelican Brief, Fences.
Love Pelican Brief.
Great. We should do that one too. John Q, The Siege, He Got Game. Feel free to add any. I think I got most of them.
No, I mean, I was going to say, as long as he mentions Remember the Titans and Training Day, I'm good. But
yeah.
No, I hear what you're saying, but I still really love his performance. The film really was carried by Denzel, even if it's hard to distinguish that kind of character from other portrayals. There are nuances to great acting that you just can't that you just can't overlook. I mean, there are a few scenes where you can see physically a face twitch. You can see the slight glance that Denzel would make that would tell so much about his motives or what his actions were going to be even before he actually did them. And I think that that's hard to mimic. And if we think of the other side of the coin, Russell Crowe doesn't have that same did not have that same level of being able to have physical tells or ways to tell the story that Denzel brought to the table.
No. I'm being, I think, maybe a little hard on Denzel. I do think he's very good in this movie. He is certainly, they got the right actor. I agree with you about Russell Crowe. I think he's miscast. We kind of teased it in the production history. I am way more interested by if Benicio del Toro or Brad Pitt were in this role. And I say that with the utmost respect because I really do love Crowe. I think he was one of the most talented actors of that era. I don't like him here. I'm not convinced by the accent that he's putting on. Maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive to that as a native New Jerseyan.
It wasn't the best accent. I don't think that's not necessarily the most damning point. But the nuance, where's the nuance? He was either mad or just very bored.
Yeah, we neither of us liked the character. We didn't find the character interesting, and he could have elevated it maybe, and he didn't. But this caught him at a kind of an interesting point in his career. He was kind of at the end of his run, but I just want to remind listeners, because his star really has faded as his weight has grown. His run from 97 to 2010, it's about as impressive as it gets. Here we go. L.A. Confidential, Mystery Alaska, The Insider, Gladiator, Proof of Life, A Beautiful Mind, Master and Commander, Cinderella Man, this movie, 3:10 to Yuma, Body of Lies, State of Play, Robin Hood.
Wonderful breadth of work. A lot of films that really lends to him being a very talented actor of his generation. I agree.
Have you ever seen Proof of Life?
I've never seen Proof of Life.
It's pretty much forgotten. It's one of my favorite movies from that era. It came out the same year as Gladiator. That's got to be the peak of his career because he wins the Oscar for Gladiator. It's a movie he did with Meg Ryan. It kind of bombed at the box office. I kind of want to cover it for this podcast, although I don't know if it was hyped, so it probably doesn't qualify. But it's our podcast; we can do whatever we want.
Yeah, we do whatever we want. I actually was going to say, for me, films that I thoroughly enjoyed maybe didn't have the same critical reception, but I loved Master and Commander. I thought,
Oh,
especially looking at the
movie's amazing.
Great, right?
I love it.
The CGI history when you look at that film, there was so much put into it that really is strong staying power through today.
You'll like this. That is the movie I use to test surround sound.
Oh, that is the way to do it.
Not even just the battle scenes.
Such a good movie.
It's not even just the battle scenes. It's the wind, the creaking of the ship, like the noises of the ocean.
You're immersed in the world.
Great. It's such a great movie. That movie actually, I think it didn't do well financially, but that movie did get the critical acclaim. That was nominated for Best Picture and a whole bunch of Oscars. That movie,
I think
people that saw it really liked it.
Yeah. No, I think that
I'm almost tempted. We should just do an episode on it just to talk about how much we love it.
I mean, it was such a good film. I think what's hard is maybe it wasn't the critical reception, but just audiences maybe didn't think about going to see that film. And it was just,
I think I know why. I think I can explain it real quick. People probably saw the trailer and expected another Gladiator, and it's a very different movie. I wouldn't call it an action movie. It's got action in it. It's not an action movie.
No, but it's a riveting story in a different way. There's a lot of action in a different way.
It's honestly one of my favorite movies. You've said on that Dark Knight Rises podcast, there's no such thing as a perfect movie. I don't know. Master and Commander.
we're touching on this again.
Not a whole lot wrong with that movie.
Well, let's keep moving along here for American Gangster, and we'll touch more on Russell Crowe. I feel like there's a lot to come back to there.
Definitely. Yeah, so we're talking about, the acting and the characters in this movie. There's a lot of secondary characters played by a lot of good actors, but they're not all addressed well. Like Cuba Gooding Jr., he plays Nicky Barnes, who was a major player in the New York drug scene, the drug empire scene. And he's barely featured here. And I would encourage listeners to, if you find the premise of this movie interesting, read up on Nicky Barnes. His story is every bit as interesting as Frank Lucas's. Chiwetel Ejiofor, who's another great actor, doesn't have a lot to do here. He plays Frank's younger brother, Huey. I wanted more of him. He's a great actor.
But not to say that it was probably the context of his time. Had not yet built the same repertoire of films. I think this was actually one of those films that really allowed more audiences to see his work.
That's a good point. Was it the year before or after he was in Inside Man with Denzel? And they were a great detective pair.
I think that was later.
Yeah, right? You might. Yeah, it's not far away, but they were real good together. And then Common plays one of his other brothers. His brothers, I feel, could have had greater roles. If this was a miniseries, you would just see more of them. Armand Assante, he plays that mafia boss. He's just a B-movie actor. But I do want to give a very special shout out to Josh Brolin, who does an amazing job at just playing a complete piece of shit, corrupt cop.
Ooh, sold it.
He's such a slime ball in this movie.
Sold it.
Like that, the part when Roberts is trying to get the marked bills back, and remember Brolin and his he that's just where he assaults the cabbie. Brolin and his crew take the money from that guy, and Roberts goes to get it back, and he's like, "You're from Jersey?" And he's like, Brolin's like, "Oh, let me think about the last time I was in Jersey. Never." such a slime ball.
Oh gosh, he he portrayed a really great, which is like one of the themes of the films is like there are some areas of gray, good guys being bad, bad guys being quote unquote good. He portrayed good, bad really, really well.
Yes, you could almost make the case the character was poorly written. He's so one-dimensionally bad. He's so corrupt. It's almost like cartoonish how bad he is. But he plays it so like, well.
Right. Which, yeah, he completely sold it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you got the others. Did you notice Joe Morton is in this movie? Really famous character actor. Miles Dyson from Terminator 2. He's he's Keanu Reeves' boss in Speed.
Okay, yeah.
But he has kind of I don't know what his character is in this movie. Is he a city official, like a reverend, a lawyer? He's at Bumpy's funeral and he shows up in a few more scenes and he's like, Bumpy always told me to take care of you, Frank. But you don't.
And then he's just there, right?
It's never explained who he is. No, never explained who he is or what he does. There's a lot of characters in the movie like this. Anyone else that you liked or didn't like?
I think that there are a few appearances by like rappers in the film that were underutilized or probably could get bigger roles. I'm a big fan of the RZA, so I actually love seeing him as part of the crew. Also, Common was in the film, but I don't think as really prominently, right?
No, he only had a handful of lines, and then T.I. plays the nephew. They were just added to the cast to appeal to younger audiences. They're famous faces, but they don't have anything to do. I guess RZA had probably the best
I was going to say RZA I've actually really respected for really investing his time in acting. He's been in a lot of films.
Yes. I guess all three of the rappers in this, they do pop up. Common's in the John Wick stuff.
Yeah, Common's was also in Smokin' Aces. I don't know if you remember that film.
I don't know. I'm drawing a blank.
Late 2000s film about a bunch of hitmen. Don't worry, you don't need to watch it.
Was he was a Common hitman?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Last but not least, Ted Levine.
Oh,
just the one, the only Buffalo
Bill.
Playing another cop for making up for all those women that he skinned back in the day.
Well, if only they'd put the lotion on the skin.
There's a cut scene from the movie where he tells Richie Roberts, he's like, look, I'm going to give you this 20 grand. You're going to go out and you're going to go buy Blue Magic heroin. Because you got to understand, Richie, when you're on heroin, you don't know what pain is.
Oh my God. So good.
I could do the whole podcast in that voice. That's what we're trying to figure out. Oh, he's in Heat, too. Plays one of the cops in Heat.
Shouts out Ted Levine.
He gets killed by Val Kilmer in the shootout.
Oh, man.
It looks like a stick-up job. Anyway. Number 4. What is memorable about this movie?
What is Patrick? What is memorable about this film?
I asked a number of people before we recorded this. They're like, "Hey, American Gangster, that's a good movie." Oh, really? What was your favorite part? The scene where Denzel Washington shoots that guy.
Let's think. What's the most original thing about this film? What does it have differently from other similar films in the category?
There's really there's no standouts.
Exactly. So there are now. I would say probably one of the stories that it's trying to hold up is that instead of it's the old-fashioned not who you expect to be in power kind of thing. It's this isn't the Italian mob, this isn't the Godfather, this is Black America. This is a film that shows a black gangster in power. which has been seen in other films, but maybe this one they're trying to really push up that as its most original element. But do we see that really told in the other parts of the film? No, the rest of the film is things that we've seen throughout.
The premise is certainly original. Like, I think maybe the closest high-profile example you got to this is like New Jack City, but that's a very different movie.
Right.
I could see Ridley Scott telling his director of photography, like, "Oh, can you make this look like Goodfellas, and also make it look like Scarface? Also, did you ever see that Mickey Rourke film, Year of the Dragon? Can you make it look like that? Also, he and The French Connection. Oh, and Serpico. And The Godfather. Can you make it look like that too?" That's how Ridley Scott talks. It's the originality piece is a very good observation. This is like a greatest hits like mashup of all the stuff that I think they were trying to hit on.
But there's already been famous New York gangster films, right? There's already been like films that show dirty cops and taking down the dirty cops. But
all those previous, examples of great gangster movies, they all have memorable scenes, right? Even like something like Scarface, which as a movie I don't really care. I'm not a Brian De Palma fan, but it's a very memorable movie. Even if you don't like something like Scarface, there's at least a half dozen extremely famous, memorable scenes in that. Memorable characters in all these gangster movies, right?
And of course, like, I think that you and I were having this discussion, and you'd ask me that same question: what was the most memorable scene from the movie? And actually, other people also brought up the same scene as well. Listeners probably, listeners recall this scene exactly, where Frank walks out of the diner, shoots Idris Elba's character Tango.
He shoots Idris Elba.
Yeah, he's Idris Elba.
Oh, we're keeping that
character in the street.
Definitely keeping that
great. In. Perfect. And it was also featured in the trailer, which is probably why there's staying power there. And it was featured in the trailer because it's such a fantastic scene. It does take a lot. And it is just. It's gorgeous, especially when you think about what does that scene do. Establishes power dominance, establishes the shift in power, tells you more about Frank's character. It was a fantastic scene, but that's it.
Right. And there's just, you don't get the characters. Where's the Turk? Like Sollozzo in The Godfather, they call him the Turk. Right. He's good with a knife. Where's the Turk? Where's Billy Batts? Where's G Money? There's so many characters in this movie. None of them are really memorable.
To be fair, even Idris Elba's character and Idris Elba is a great actor.
He's a great actor. He was in 2 scenes.
Couldn't build up more to that character to truly be a rival that could be overtaken with such to be taken out as like really a moving pivotal scene. If they had built that character up more, maybe it would have mattered more. But at the end of the day, it could have just been any other gangster on the street that Denzel took out.
Yeah. I guess Josh Brolin's character, I think, is the only memorable one. I'll give him credit for that. But there's a lot of expositionary dialogue in here that has to explain who people are. Good movies don't do that. Like, remember where he calls his family and he's like, "Hey, it's your brother Frank," and he calls the guy in Vietnam, "Hey, it's your cousin Frank."
Right.
It's a little awkward.
A lot of exposition.
A little expositionary. But another thing, this is something that's a mainstay of other Ridley Scott movies that is not here. This movie really could have benefited from a top-tier film composer. The music that you find, like, think about the scores to Blade Runner, Gladiator, Black Hawk Down. A lot of Ridley Scott movies he works with someone like Hans Zimmer. There's nothing about the music in here that's memorable. It's kind of a mishmash of blues and soul and classical film score. Something like that is can elevate the movie. And we mentioned this before. The two lead actors, they don't meet till 2.5 hours into this movie. Now, in preparation for this podcast,
love this.
I watched an interview with the now canceled Charlie Rose, who he was interviewing Ridley Scott, Denzel, and Russell Crowe at the same time. It's a pretty cool interview. They're talking about this movie. And Ridley Scott explained how he agreed with the studio executive who thought that was a problem, that the two leads didn't meet until 2 hours and 30 minutes into the movie. And then he goes on to explain in the interview why he didn't think it would be an issue, right? Even though he agreed with it initially. So he's acknowledging it was a problem, and yet he doesn't do anything to address it. His excuse was that the audience would be waiting for these characters to meet. The studio was right to flag that. 2.5 hours is just way too long. Yeah, you think about in Heat, which is probably the best example of the duopoly, right? I forget when they have that diner scene, but it's more or less halfway through the movie. And that's also a very lengthy movie. So you're not waiting the whole time for these two guys to come face to face.
Right. But at the end of the day, is there such a better tale of cat and mouse of the duopoly than there is Face Off?
That's certainly the most flagrant example. I'm not Castor Troy.
You didn't have to wait a second for them to meet.
They took his face off. You mentioned you mentioned the lack of originality. Empire Magazine's Ian Freer, in his review, says, quote, "Very little in the movie feels fresh, like retreading scenes, riffs, and imagery from the whole history of crime flicks," end quote. He also mentioned that the film did not explore enough of Lucas's story and Scott's visual imagination. Bingo.
Yeah.
There are some good lines in this movie, though.
Oh yeah. Let's hit it. What are some highlights?
That's $25,000 alpaca. You blot that shit.
You blot that shit. Such a good saying.
Simple Simon ass motherfuckers. The loudest one in the room is always the weakest. I like that. And then, my man.
Great film. Or great line. My man.
Yeah, I think that was a little harsh on Denzel. He,
just the delivery of those lines too, the subtleness. You can't not think of Denzel
you're right.
delivering those lines.
They definitely.
I think he carried that film. It was a hard carry. Like they cast Frank Lucas right.
You're absolutely right. Man, if this would have been a disaster with Will Smith. He's just not meant.
No.
I don't know about some of the research on this. You have to take with a grain of salt. I can't believe they considered him for this role. He's very charismatic, but he's not menacing.
It's the draw, though, right? It's the draw.
Yeah.
Because actually, in that same era, when did Ali release? Was 2001. In 2001? 2002?
Yeah. 2001.
Yeah, and so if we're really entering in that realm of like Will Smith's like more dramatic tone, or the dramatic tone era for Will Smith, actually this could have been a really good next step for him, but not necessarily the same dramatic chops that Denzel has to really sell this role and really be Frank Lucas.
Yeah.
But we're here we are
wrapping it all up. We talked about the reasons why this movie wasn't better. Number 1, was Ridley Scott the right director? Number 2, flawed storytelling. Number 3, the acting and the characters. And number 4, it's not memorable. Taking all of this into consideration, Anton, because you hadn't seen it in a while, and you watched it, I think, over the past couple of days. What'd you think of it? Right. Did you like it?
This was my take. There were so many great scenes that were shot beautifully. There were so many great lines delivered with such ferocity by Denzel. When I think of it, I think of like going through, like, if I'm traveling through New York and looking through the great sights of the city. It's like I'm traveling through, and especially visually. The way that they were able to like really capture is a very pretty film.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if I'm thinking about the analogy of comparing it to being of like feeling like I'm traveling through New York, the story itself is someplace that I've been before. It's a gangster. I've seen a ton of films about gangsters, about crime, about corruption. And in that sense, there were points where I felt I've seen this film before, but with different actors. And for the parts, and for a story that really had a lot of potential in the premise to be unique, it wasn't able to tell the story effectively in a way that paid off, in a way that was unique, or even in a way that I, as a consumer, felt like I was watching something unique. I think that it was a great opportunity to tell Frank Lucas's story and really examine crime and corruption and two sides of the coin and areas of gray. But at the end of the day, like for me, it just it didn't live up to that. It didn't live up to the themes that they were trying to portray. So it was fun. There were some parts that were fun, but overall, I feel like it could have been a much better film. I was disappointed.
Your rating?
If I like, I'm gonna have to give it a C minus, C minus to C, because if it wasn't Denzel, probably it would have gone down a grade. But it was just so jarring to go between the storylines just as I get invested, and there was too much that kind of felt like ornaments to tell a story versus the storytelling really being on the forefront and moving the movie along. So yeah, I'll give it a C minus.
I'm not far off from you. You touched on how well made it is. We talked about Scott, his visual style. It's a very competent movie. If you're going down a checklist of everything that you want in a movie, it does everything competently, right? You're like, oh, the acting's good. The visuals are good. Actually, I don't think it does everything competently. I don't know where I was going with that. But you just look at this movie on paper and it should have been so much better.
Right.
There's so many promising elements in it. The elements involved in it are great, but I can't think of one single thing that it actually does great. Aside, if you want to give Denzel's standalone performance, it's a great performance. Is it one of his 10 best performances? No. But the man's not capable of giving a bad performance, as far as I say. I've never seen him give a bad performance.
Right, and it's like going to a game and getting a home run from your player. Not necessarily the best game ever, but you know they're going to hit a home run.
Yeah, it's kind of like Alex Rodriguez. Maybe
consistent,
great stats, very consistent.
Yeah.
If it's a playoff game, you're like, eh. Look, the cast and the director, I thought that they would make this movie come to life. But when I saw this back in 2007 when it came out, I left the theater pretty numb. I felt like it dragged, like it didn't know where it was going. I feel the same way when I watched it just a few days ago. Kind of reminds me in some ways of The Dark Knight Rises. Just like that movie. Well, The Dark Knight Rises came after this, but just like with that movie, about an hour into this movie, I kind of looked at my watch and I'm like, where's this going? It would have benefited from either being shorter or much longer in the form of a miniseries, I feel. The premise was great. The actors are great. The director's great. And yet the end result, there isn't anything great about it. I would give it like a C or a C plus. I think it's pretty good. It's solid. It's better than average. But on paper, this is a 5-star movie. And that's my problem with it. It is because it doesn't do any one thing great, I'm almost offended. But on one note, it did inspire Jay-Z's last truly great album, the American Gangster album that he made inspired by this movie is a really good album.
Props to that. Hova, an inspired Hova always makes for a happy Patrick and a happy Anton.
Absolutely. So this is your turn to pick a movie, but I have an announcement, and I don't know if you want to incorporate this into your pick. So our great producer Eric Taylor, he saw on our short list that we are going to talk about the Lost World Jurassic Park. He very much wants to talk about that movie.
Okay. That's a great position for me to think about. All right, a lot of pressure of what next film to choose. So
he's going to defend that movie's honor.
All right, listener, tune in to our next episode and see what film did I choose for us to review in our next installment of Why Wasn't It Better?
That's it. We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.